Divine Soul. The energy around this first card is unusually specific. I'm being shown a wealthy, influential masculine surrounded by women who have access to his world, his attention, and the lifestyle attached to his name. But something has slipped beyond his control. He told one of them the truth about you, and that truth did not remain where it was spoken. So what exactly did he admit? Who heard it first, and why is your name carrying weight inside circles you have never entered? The Fool appears here as psychological symbolism, not as a promise of destiny. It represents the moment a controlled man realizes that love cannot be managed like a business decision. This masculine is accustomed to planning every move, calculating every risk, and protecting his image. Yet when it comes to you, he is standing at the edge of something he cannot predict. I'm shown him late at night in a room, his jacket off, his phone glowing against the darkness. He opens your page, studies a photograph, then locks the screen as though someone might catch him, even though he is alone. Seconds later, he unlocks it again. This pattern has become more visible than he understands. His assistant noticed the way he stopped mid-sentence when your name appeared in a message. A colleague saw him turn his phone face down when she walked near him. Another woman, polished and comfortable in his world, watched his expression soften before he quickly recovered. None of them had the full story. They only had fragments, but that was only the beginning. At a dinner, one woman finally teased him about the person he kept checking on. She expected a smile, a dismissal, perhaps a joke. Instead, he went silent. His hand tightened around the glass, his eyes lowered for one moment. Then he said enough to change the atmosphere. He told her you were not like the others. You never chased his money, adjusted yourself to impress him, or treated him like a prize to be won. His voice stayed calm, but the seriousness behind it made her stop smiling. The Fool shows the part of him that wants to step forward without knowing whether you will meet him there. His wealth gave him options. His status gave him access. But neither gave him courage where you are concerned. And the secret did not stop with that conversation. The woman left that dinner carrying more than curiosity. She carried a question she could not dismiss. Why would a man who had been pursued, praised, and accommodated by so many women speak about you with that level of respect? Later that evening, she made a private call. She did not repeat his exact words. She softened them first, removing the silence in his voice and the way his expression changed when he spoke about you. She simply told another woman that there was someone he could not treat casually. The woman on the other end paused. She already knew your name, not because he had introduced you, not because you had entered their circle. She had heard it once before when someone asked why he had declined an invitation at the last minute. His answer had been vague, but your name appeared in the explanation for only a second. Now that second carried new meaning. The Page of Swords appears here as psychological symbolism. It represents observation, guarded conversations, and information moving faster than the person at the center of it realizes. Someone watches a reaction. Someone asks a careful question. Someone remembers a detail that seemed unimportant at the time. Then the fragments begin connecting. At a private event days later, one woman mentioned you indirectly. She described your work, your appearance, or something connected to your life without saying your name. His attention shifted immediately. It was subtle, but not subtle enough. Across the room, two women exchanged a look. Nothing was said. It did not need to be. Divine Soul. These women are not only asking whether he has feelings for you. They are trying to understand the power of those feelings. They have seen him receive admiration without being moved by it. They have watched beautiful, accomplished women position themselves close to him and still fail to reach the private part of his mind. Yet your name changes his posture. Your absence changes his mood. And when someone speaks about you incorrectly, he becomes unusually precise. One woman tested this. She suggested that perhaps you had been interested in his lifestyle and lost patience when he did not offer enough attention. His eyes hardened. No, he said. That was never who she was. The correction came too quickly. The Page of Swords shows why his secret is spreading. He is attempting to protect the truth while revealing it through every defense, every pause, and every question he refuses to answer directly. But one woman did not need to collect fragments. She heard the confession without edits. And what he admitted to her explains why his behavior around you has recently become almost impossible to hide. The woman he trusted was not impressed by his title. She had known him before the private rooms, the carefully managed invitations, and the people who laughed too quickly at his jokes. She remembered the version of him who had not yet learned to hide uncertainty behind authority. That is why he spoke differently with her. There was no performance, no polished explanation. He sat across from her, late in the evening, his sleeves rolled back, his attention fixed on something beyond the window. She asked why your name kept entering conversations he claimed were unrelated to you. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he admitted that you had seen him too clearly. Not the man other people described. Not the wealth, the influence, or the life that made women curious about what being close to him could provide. You had responded to the person underneath all of it, and that unsettled him. The Page of Pentacles appears here as psychological symbolism. It represents the moment someone realizes that something genuine must be approached with patience, humility, and real effort. It is not the confidence of a man who assumes every door will open for him. It is the hesitation of someone holding something valuable and wondering whether he is mature enough to care for it properly. He told this woman that you never competed for his attention. You did not become louder when others entered the room. You did not reshape yourself to remain desirable to him. And when his behavior became inconsistent, you did something he was not accustomed to seeing. You stepped back. That distance affected him more than pursuit ever had. Divine soul, admiration was familiar to him. Honesty was not. Other women had praised his ambition. You questioned the emotional cost of it. Others accepted the version of him that appeared composed. You noticed when he was avoiding something. And instead of using that knowledge to move closer to his lifestyle, you expected him to become more truthful. His confidant watched him carefully. "Do you miss her?" she asked. He lowered his eyes. "I miss who I was around her," he said. "I didn't have to prove anything. That was the confession without edits. It was not simply that he wanted you. It was that your presence made him aware of how much of his life had been built around being valued for what he could offer. You made him question whether he could be valued without it." The Page of Pentacles shows the vulnerability beneath his restraint. He knows genuine connection cannot be purchased, rushed, or delegated to someone else. It requires him to arrive without the armor that has protected him for years. His confidant leaned forward. "Then why are you still doing nothing?" His expression changed. And when he finally answered, he admitted the fear he had never spoken aloud. "What if she already knows who I really am and decides I'm not enough?" His confidant did not answer immediately. She had watched this man negotiate under pressure, remove people from his life without hesitation, and make decisions that affected everyone around him. She had never heard him question whether he was enough, especially not for one woman. The Nine of Swords appears here as psychological symbolism. It represents the private anxiety created when someone can control nearly every external circumstance, but cannot control how another person now sees them. His fear is not dramatic on the surface. It appears in repetition, delay, and the thoughts that become louder when the room is quiet. I'm shown him writing a message to you after midnight. He begins carefully. Dispriss it. Starts again with something casual. Dispreets that too. For one moment, his thumb remains over the screen while your name sits above an empty message box. He wants to ask whether you are well, but he knows that question is smaller than the truth between you. So he locks the phone, then reaches for it again. Divine Soul, his hesitation is not the absence of feeling. It is the absence of control. In other areas of his life, his name opens doors. His money removes inconvenience. His authority changes the direction of a conversation. But none of those things can make you trust him again if his silence taught you not to. That is what troubles him. He wonders whether you interpreted his delay as indifference, whether you stopped expecting honesty from him, whether you saw the distance between his words and his actions and decided that peace without him was better than confusion with him. During an important meeting, someone asks him a direct question. He does not hear it. His attention has shifted to a message from a mutual connection. He asks, too casually, whether you have been traveling, whether you seem happy, whether someone new has entered your life. The questions reveal more than he intends. Days later, he changes a travel plan after learning you may be in the same city. Then he changes it back, unwilling to admit why he considered going. The Nine of Swords shows the conflict beneath these reversals. Approaching you would require more than a message. It could force him to explain decisions he postponed, attachments he left unclear, and parts of his life he assumed you would simply accept. His confidant finally understood. He was not afraid of losing control of his world. He was afraid of entering yours and discovering that it had become calmer without him. But the door to the room had not been fully closed. Another woman had heard part of the conversation. She heard your name. She heard his fear of losing you. And instead of recognizing his vulnerability, she interpreted it as a challenge she needed to defeat. She did not approach him immediately. That would have revealed too much. Instead, she waited until a setting where her questions could sound casual, a private gathering, familiar faces. Music low enough that certain comments could be heard, without appearing intentional. She stood beside him and spoke about timing, about how some people mistake distance for depth, about women who disappear, then expect to remain important. Her tone was light, but her eyes remained on his expression. He gave her nothing at first. Then she mentioned you, not directly. She referred to something you had supposedly said, an old story repeated without context. She suggested that perhaps you had already moved on and simply enjoyed knowing he was still affected. His jaw tightened. The Eight of Swords appears here as psychological symbolism. It represents the tension created by incomplete information, assumptions, and the belief that every response carries a consequence. This woman thinks she is trapping him inside a careful conversation. If he defends you too strongly, he reveals himself. If he remains silent, she is free to define you in his presence. For several seconds, he looks toward the other side of the room. Then he says, "You do not know her well enough to say that." His voice is controlled, but the correction is clear. The woman smiles as though she has not noticed. She asks whether you were truly as independent as he claimed, or whether you simply knew how to make yourself difficult to replace. He turns toward her then. She was never playing that kind of game. That sentence changes something. Divine Soul, the surprise is not that this woman wants his attention. She is accustomed to receiving it. She knows how to enter his conversations, how to remain near him without appearing to pursue, and how to make comparisons sound like concern. The surprise is that he refuses to let you be reduced. Even in your absence, he does not declare his feelings. He does not explain the history. But every time she attempts to turn your distance into manipulation, he corrects the version of you she is creating. The Eight of Swords shows the position he has placed himself in. He wants to protect the secret, yet protecting your character exposes why the secret matters. Someone nearby hears part of the exchange. A woman who had always assumed you were temporary. Someone who believed his silence meant you had never reached him deeply enough to matter. She watches him end the conversation early. She notices that he leaves irritated, not because his own reputation was questioned, but because yours was. Later, she asks the woman what happened. The answer reaches her in fragments, but one detail remains intact. He defended you. And before the night ended, she decided she would confront him privately and ask the question no one else had been willing to ask. The confrontation happened after the event, inside a quiet car with the engine still running. She had known him long enough to recognize the difference between distraction and emotional involvement. She had seen him lose interest before. She had seen him become briefly curious, then return to his usual control. This was not that. She waited until the driver stepped away, then turned toward him. "Is she a memory?" she asked. "Or are you planning to do something about this?" He looked through the window, no immediate answer. The Knight of Pentacles appears here as psychological symbolism. It represents deliberate movement, accountability, and the point where careful preparation can no longer be used as an excuse for emotional delay. This is someone who wants every condition to be secure before taking a step. But feelings do not remain untouched while a person prepares forever. She reminded him of what everyone had begun noticing. He still checked on you. He remembered details from conversations no one else considered important. He defended your character when you were not present. He reacted whenever someone suggested you had moved on. Yet he had not spoken to you honestly. "What exactly are you protecting?" she asked. His expression tightened. He said he had believed distance was the responsible choice. His world had been complicated at the time. Business pressure, family expectations, private obligations, and people who treated every personal decision as information to be used. He thought he needed to resolve everything first. Then he would approach you correctly, without confusion, without bringing disorder into your life. The explanation sounded reasonable until she asked one more question. "And what did your silence bring into her life?" He looked down. That was the part he had avoided. Divine soul. He wanted to believe that withholding himself had protected you. But protection without communication can feel exactly like abandonment to the person left waiting for clarity. His delay may have created the hurt he claimed he was trying to prevent. The Knight of Pentacles shows the flaw in his strategy. He confused slow movement with honorable intention. He assumed that because his feelings remained steady, you would somehow know they had not disappeared. But you could not see his private preparation. You could only see his absence. The woman leaned back and studied him. "If she matters this much, stop speaking about her to everyone except her." He remained silent for a moment. Then he said, "I have already started." She turned toward him. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded document. Not a gift, not an extravagant gesture designed to impress you. It was proof that he had quietly removed one of the obstacles he once used to justify staying away. He had made a decision, a practical one, a permanent one, and almost no one knew he had done it yet. The document confirmed that he had ended an arrangement others assumed would continue. It was not a dramatic relationship in the way people might imagine. It was an understanding. A connection kept open because it was convenient, socially acceptable, and useful to several people around him. He had allowed the ambiguity to remain because confronting it would create questions. Now he had closed it. The Seven of Swords appears here as psychological symbolism. It represents private strategy, concealed preparation, and the desire to act before outside voices can interfere. It does not automatically indicate deception. Here, it shows a man making a significant move in silence because he does not yet trust the people around him with the truth. The woman unfolded the document and read enough to understand. A shared obligation had been separated. A future commitment had been withdrawn. Something that once gave another woman reason to believe she still had a place beside him was no longer in effect. "You did this because of her?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. He said he had done it because continuing the arrangement was dishonest. But the pause before his response revealed the part he was still protecting. Your presence had forced the decision. Divine Soul, this was the first evidence that his feelings had moved beyond watching, remembering, and speaking about you in private. He had changed something real. Something that could not be restored with a casual explanation if you rejected him. That is why he told almost no one. He feared being seen preparing for a future you might not want. He feared other people turning his decision into gossip before he had the courage to speak to you. And beneath all of that was a quieter fear. What if he cleared the path and still arrived too late? The Seven of Swords shows why he moved carefully. He wanted to remove the obstacle before approaching you, not use the promise of removing it to keep you emotionally available. But secrecy has a way of leaving evidence. Days later, a woman in his circle noticed that her name had disappeared from a private schedule. An invitation that normally included her had been changed. A financial or professional connection between them had been formally revised. She asked his assistant what had happened. The assistant gave no explanation. That silence told her enough. By evening, she had obtained a fragment of the truth. Not the entire document, not his private confession. Only proof that he had made a permanent decision shortly after people began speaking openly about you. She confronted him in a room where several others were still present. Did you change all of this for her? Every conversation stopped. He could protect his image by denying it. Or he could finally tell them exactly what you meant to him. He did not deny it. For several seconds, he allowed the silence to remain. The woman who first heard the truth was standing near the doorway. The one who had tested him with careful remarks watched from across the room. His confidant said nothing, but her expression made it clear that this was the moment she had expected him to avoid. The woman holding the fragment of evidence waited. "Well," she asked. He looked at the document in her hand. Then he said, "She was part of the reason." The answer was calm, but it removed every comfortable explanation. Someone suggested that he was idealizing you because you had become unavailable. Another said he was disrupting arrangements that had protected his reputation for years over a connection that might exist more strongly in his mind than in reality. He listened without interrupting. The Five of Cups appears here as psychological symbolism. It represents regret, emotional consequence, and the moment someone can no longer focus only on what they intended. They must face what their choices actually caused. He did not raise his voice. "She is not a distraction," he said, "and she was never interested in what being near me could give her." The room became still again. He spoke about your self-respect. The way you could leave a conversation without trying to win it. The way you noticed what people avoided saying. The way you remained calm when others expected you to compete for his attention. She saw things everyone else ignored, he said. The competitive woman shifted slightly. Then someone asked why. If you understood him so well, you were no longer beside him. That question reached the place his money could not defend. Because I mishandled it. No excuse followed. Divine Soul. This was the truth they had not expected him to admit. He acknowledged that he used timing, responsibility, and pressure as reasons to remain emotionally unavailable. He believed he could repair the situation later, once everything around him was controlled. But wealth can replace an opportunity. It cannot replace trust. Status can influence a room. It cannot erase the memory of being left without clarity. The Five of Cups shows him finally looking at the damage instead of the intention behind it. He had not stepped away because you meant little. He stepped away while assuming your feelings would remain where he left them. And now he understands the arrogance inside that assumption. No one challenged him after that. The conversations ended slowly. One person left, then another. The woman holding the document placed it on the table and walked away without speaking. Eventually, he was alone. He sat down, removed his phone, and opened your page. This time, he did not lock the screen. He opened the empty message box and began writing the truth he had avoided for far too long. At first, he writes as though he is preparing another explanation. He mentions the pressure around him, the timing, the responsibilities he believed required his attention before he could approach you properly. Then he stops, reads it once, dispreets the entire paragraph. Because he knows those reasons may explain his silence, but they do not excuse what the silence communicated. He begins again. I should have spoken to you directly. The sentence remains on the screen. He adds that you did not deserve mixed signals, that his distance may have made you question whether the connection mattered to him at all. He writes that he noticed when you stepped back, but instead of responding with honesty, he allowed pride and fear to keep making decisions for him. Then he deletes the word fear, types uncertainty, dispreets that too. Finally, he puts fear back. The moon appears here as psychological symbolism. It represents the confusion created when feelings remain hidden, intentions are left unexplained, and both people are forced to interpret shadows instead of receiving the truth. It is not a guarantee that this message will bring a certain outcome. It reflects the inner pattern he can no longer pretend is harmless. Divine soul he considers offering to send something, a gift, a gesture, evidence that he has thought about you, but he removes that line. He knows money would only make the message easier for him, not more meaningful for you. So he writes about the silence. He acknowledges that other people now know pieces of what he should have told you first. They know that he defended you. They know he changed an arrangement. They know your absence affected him. But you were left with uncertainty. That realization changes the tone of the message. It becomes less polished, more honest. He writes that he does not expect immediate forgiveness. He does not know whether you will answer. He does not know whether you still want the conversation he delayed for so long, and for once, he does not try to control that outcome. The moon shows the part of him learning to move without complete reassurance. He has spent years avoiding emotional risk by waiting until every possibility could be calculated. But there is no calculation that can tell him whether your heart remained open. His finger hovers above the screen. The message is longer than he intended. Not dramatic, not perfect, but direct enough that he cannot deny what it means. Before we see whether he sends it, notice what has already changed. The secret that escaped into his circle has forced him to hear his own truth spoken back to him. And now the man who once feared being exposed is beginning to fear something more. Remaining hidden now carries a greater cost than being honest. His finger lowers. The message sends. There is no dramatic sound, no immediate reply. Only the quiet confirmation on the screen that the truth has finally left his hands and entered yours. He stares at it for several seconds, then places the phone beside him. The Six of Cups appears here as psychological symbolism. It represents emotional memory, sincerity, and the desire to return to what felt genuine before fear complicated it. It is not a promise that the past will be restored exactly as it was. It shows someone recognizing that a meaningful connection cannot be reduced to nostalgia and private regret. It must be met with honesty in the present. Divine soul, this is why his secret is everywhere. One woman knows that he defended your character. Another knows that he ended an arrangement he had tolerated for too long. His confidant knows that he fears your rejection more than he fears public failure. His assistant has watched him rearrange plans and lose focus whenever your name appears. Each person holds a different fragment, but every fragment points toward the same truth. You reached the part of him that status could not protect. He could control access to his time. He could manage his image. He could surround himself with people who understood the rules of his world. But he could not make your absence feel unimportant, and he could not continue pretending that what happened between you was casual when his own behavior kept exposing otherwise. The Six of Cups shows the difference between remembering someone and becoming accountable to what that memory reveals. He is no longer only missing the way you made him feel. He is being forced to examine the version of himself that allowed fear to speak louder than honesty. But his feelings do not create an obligation for you. You do not need to compete with the women around him. You do not need to prove that you are more beautiful, more patient, or more deserving. And you do not need to pause your life while he learns how to approach yours correctly. His confession explains the silence. It does not erase it. His message creates an opening. It does not decide what you must do with that opening. Only consistent action can show whether he is prepared to become the man he described when he spoke about you to others. So let the secret be his burden no longer. The truth has reached you now. And the question is no longer whether you mattered to him. The question is whether what he offers next will be worthy of the peace you built without him.